Are you searching for purpose of life? Discover your true identity. Stay tuned to Shalom World.
Where is God in the midst of COVID-19? What is going to happen? Hello and welcome to Hope Spot on Shalom World. I'm your host, Robert Feduccia from Nashville, Tennessee in the United States. And Hope Spot is designed to give you hope and insight for living during this time of global pandemic. And today's topic is on youth isolation, and the pandemic. And joining us today are two guests from Australia. First, we have Mr. Malcolm Hart. And Malcolm Hart is the former director of youth for the Australian Conference of Catholic Bishops, but now he is overseeing all of their evangelization efforts for the Center for Evangelization there with the Conference of Bishops. Malcolm, welcome. It's good to have you with us.
Thanks very much, Robert. It's really great to be.
And also joining us is Ashleigh Donnelly. Ashleigh is a social worker for Centacare. She has also been invited to serve on the International Youth Advisory Body for the Holy See. And they knew about her because she was also involved with the pre-synod meetings with the Synod for Young Adults. So thank you very much for joining us, Ashleigh. It's an honor to have you with us.
Thanks, Robert. It's an honor to be here.
I want to ask you, could you give us some insight into young people right now, and particularly this generation? I guess I have a couple of questions. First, are they different? What's different about growing up today? And are there unique challenges that face them that say that I did not, or Malcolm or other people have not in previous generations?
Absolutely. I think that it is very different for young people growing up today. I mean, I think that fundamental search for identity and that longing to answer that question of who am I is common to young people throughout history. But I think there is a difference for young people today. And I think the difference is that this search for identity is compounded by all these other issues that make the transition to adulthood so much more difficult. I mean, I speak for myself as a young person growing up in Australia and also as a social worker working with young people. But I can definitely say that in my own context, mental health is definitely an issue that I'm seeing more and more of and is hugely prevalent amongst young people today. I remember a few years ago I was working with a young 14-year-old girl and every night she would go to bed with her phone on loud under her pillow and it would beep throughout the night and she'd respond to messages and she was getting really sleep deprived and I remember saying to her, can you just turn your phone on silent for 7 to 8 hours? And she said, but what if someone makes a comment about me throughout the night and I can't respond to it or remove it straight away? And I think this is all too common, this story, and I think it is an issue with young people constantly being on and constantly being available and is a huge factor contributing towards mental health issues that we are seeing in young people today. I think a huge issue as well is anxiety about the future. Young people know that issues in the world like climate change and the environment are issues that are going to affect young people into the future. They're issues that aren't going away and that does contribute to a sense of feeling out of control and not knowing what to do. And I think another challenge as well is just that ability to be able to make decisions and discern one's vocation as a young person with so many options out there in the world, and it makes that process a lot more difficult. Many of us would be familiar with this concept of FOMO or fear of missing out, and I think that whole issue of young people delaying important life decisions is huge. So, yeah, I think that for sure, as I mentioned, that search for identity is common to youth throughout generations, but But definitely today, there are some very, very unique challenges faced by young people, with mental health being a huge one.
All right, so just the search for identity, mental health, and then that fear of missing out, this anxiety about the future, and so you don't want to make a decision because that may cut you off, and you would be afraid that opportunities would go away. Is that right? Do I hear that correctly?
Yeah, for sure. That's right. Yeah.
All right, so coming to that, that's outside of the pandemic. So, what has the pandemic done to either exacerbate that or mitigate those factors?
Yeah, so I think, look, in my opinion, from what I've seen in my experience, that the pandemic has definitely exacerbated a lot of this. And in a very short space of time, at least in Australia, young people have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. A huge factor is loss of jobs. In Australia, they say that one in 10 people under the age of 20 have lost a job since March in Australia. And it's quite similar for young people in their 20s. And I think the thing with work is that work provides all of us with a sense of dignity and a sense of purpose. So when we do lose our jobs, it's more than just a financial blow. It's a blow. It makes us question our sense of self and our sense of worth as a person. So that's been huge. I was talking to a young person recently who was fortunate to be able to keep her job. But she was saying that amongst her friends, that for those who have lost their jobs, one of the huge challenges has been being at home in households where there's just exacerbated conflict. Conflict in households has increased dramatically in many situations just through being around each other 24/7. But also in some situations it is more serious. There are cases of domestic violence that young people are exposed to. And in Australia, and I'm sure in many other countries, domestic violence has it's been reported more, and it's more of an issue during this pandemic. I think unhealthy coping mechanisms is another thing that young people are turning to during the pandemic. A lot of the things that young people might normally do, like go to the gym or go out to a cafe with friends, aren't necessarily possible now, or haven't been for a few months. And from conversations that I've had, some young people are turning to alcohol and are turning to unhealthy coping mechanisms, which is a huge, huge issue. And then there's the lack of structure. Things like uni and school and work, they provide us with structure. And young people need structure for that sense of stability and security. And when young people don't have that structure, it exacerbates anxiety. Anxiety becomes even more of an issue, and particularly for young people who are prone to anxiety in the first place. And then finally, I think as well, for young people on a faith journey, it's a really, really hard time. It was only a few years ago that we were in Poland hearing Pope Francis talking about getting off the couch and putting on a pair of walking shoes. So what does it say when we are literally, many of us are stuck on the couch and maybe I felt called to do something in particular, but what does that mean now? Was what I thought I was called to do really what God was calling me to do in the first place? And it can be a really confusing time.
Well, Ashleigh, thanks for bringing up just the Holy Father and the church aspect of everything. So Malcolm, you are deeply rooted, both in a pastoral standpoint with the people of God, but you're also deeply rooted in the ecclesial structure. So my question is, it's about what I've seen with John Paul II. He seemed to usher in this focus on young people, focus the church's attention on young people with, as was mentioned, World Youth Day. That's an institution that he started. And now there seems to be momentum towards a pastoral focus on young people. So hearing what Ashleigh has said, where is the momentum in the church with the attention to young people?
Well, I think Pope Francis has really not just continued the work of St. John Paul II, but built upon it. By calling the synod, he's enabled this global discussion and dialogue and discernment about the role and life of young people in the church. So what happened is we've talked about the impact of John Paul II's mission and creating World Youth Days and the changes that that's made in the church over the last 3 decades. but it's also drawn us into where to next. What's the next step in our evolution of youth ministry? And what the General Synod and subsequently Christus Vivit, the exhortation that Pope Francis has given us, it moves us from just inspiring young people to utilising young people, to actually doing more than just focusing on the evangelization of young people for attention, but actually calling the church to utilise young people in their co-responsible leadership, interpretation of the world in today's world and how the church can engage in it. But also calling young people to take up their baptismal call, to live a life worthy of Christ's imitation of their vocation. So the Synod, Pope Francis himself, and this whole process over the last 3 decades, which has brought us to this point of the General Synod and Christus Vivit, has really not just only highlighted the role and importance of young people, but their value, their contribution, and really identified some of the things that we need to do differently moving forward.
So could you give us a couple of the highlights and then how it can be a guide for us and particularly for parents in how to guide our young people through this time?
Well, Christus Vivit, I think, is such a critical document for the life and journey of young people in the church. And there's so much in it. It's really difficult sometimes to focus on, what is the key aspects of this. But I think the two things that really stand out to me are accompaniment and synodality. And accompaniment was a theme that came through in the pre-synod documents and during the synod very strongly. And what it calls for is young people to be journeyed with, not preached at, not instructed, but to be accompanied. And Pope Francis talks about in the document about, not just having pre-packaged answers to things, but actually walking with young people, having a conversation with them, helping them interpret the Holy Spirit at work in their lives, so they can see the joys and work of the Spirit happening around them. That's the example that Jesus gave us on the road to Emmaus. He walked with the disciples all day in the wrong direction, away from Jerusalem, but he accompanied those disciples until they had their own realization and turned around and came back. That's the example instruction that Pope Francis gives us through accompaniment. And connected to that is this idea of synodality. And speaking to many of those who are at the General Synod, they would say that this is a term that wasn't necessarily thrown around or used a lot, but its concept was spoken about very often, about how do we utilise the full diversity and breadth and wisdom of the church to accompany young people. And synodality is about journeying together. It's about helping young people discern their place, their vocation, their calling that the Holy Spirit has in life for them. So how are we accompanying young people and drawing them into the diversity and universality of the church? And I think that's an invitation not just for youth ministers or priests, but also parents, about how are we actually coming to an understanding and getting to know each young person, each child, and what they're called to, what their gifts and strengths are. And that comes down to that relationship. And accompaniment is one of those things which I think is relevant for the whole church, not just this ministry with young people, but it's so life-giving. And Pope Francis talks about how accompaniment not only assists the young person, but actually brings to life for the older generation their faith. It renews them in the spirit and energy of young people to go out and continue their ministry.
So, Ashleigh, I want to go to you just with that thought about accompaniment, synodality. I want to bring some research to you that has been done here in the United States. I want to see if it's true there in Australia, because synodality, accompaniment seems to be a real need. And the reason why I say that is because the research being done here in the United States is pointing to something that's very alarming. And that is, we may be living with the loneliest generation of young people ever. That's happening here in the United States. So first, does that resonate with your experience in Australia? Is that something that's limited here, or do you see that as well? And then how do you see accompaniment, if that is your case, how do you see accompaniment being the antidote to that?
Sure, to start with, I think that's definitely the case here. Loneliness is such an issue, and particularly among young people today. I think the really scary thing about loneliness is that it it can lead young people to make decisions out of, fear of being alone rather than out of, a knowledge of what God might want for me or might want for my future. And it can lead young people to do things like to befriend people who might be destructive or critical, and in some cases, even marry the wrong person out of that fear of being alone. But I think in terms of what parents and what adult mentors can do to accompany young people who are grappling with this, this concept of this experience of loneliness, is really to encourage self-awareness of, that why am I feeling lonely, and what can be done, to address that. I was listening to a great homily on the weekend by a priest in my diocese, and he was talking about this lonely space that's within all of us, that's made by God and can only be filled by God, and is oriented towards, the infinite and the transcendent. And particularly in this time, this time at the moment when things have slowed down and all the usual things around us, all those distractions aren't there, we're becoming more aware of that space within us, that lonely space. And I think that that's something that mentors, that parents, that youth leaders can do, is to really encourage a young person to look at loneliness and then look at where that kind of fits into the young person's faith journey. What I do want to mention, though, that I think that there is a difference between, the mild feelings of loneliness and severe loneliness. And severe loneliness that can lead to negative self-talk and self-harm and severe mental health issues. And I think it is important to distinguish that when we are seeing those severe cases, to see a professional. But Robert, definitely, I think that this is a huge opportunity for accompanying young people to make sense out of our loneliness.
Yeah. Well, Malcolm, you and I have met and interacted in the youth ministry world, and the research seems to be pointing towards three things. And one of them, Ashleigh, you mentioned that self-awareness, that a prayerful young person is most likely to stay. It seems to be three things that keep young people in the church, into long-term relationship with the Lord in the church. One would be prayer. The second would be families that have conversation about the faith and have rituals in the faith. But the third is this one statistic that has come here, and that is, speaking again from Ashleigh, the self-reflection, prayer, but a 5-to-1 ratio. And what we mean by that is that every young person is able to identify 5 adults that would be in their life from their church. So if you are speaking with parishes about how to engage, how to accompany, how to enter into synodality with young people, what would you say to parishes that are looking to do that, to cure the isolation that they're experiencing?
Look, it's very difficult at the moment, I think, in this current isolation, because we can't physically get together. And I think what we've seen in Australia is there's some parishes who have had good community structures that are in some ways thriving through this pandemic, and others that haven't had that strong community have really shut the doors and said, we'll open again when we can. They haven't continued that community connection. So I think the real issue at the heart of this is that relationship. And you mentioned that sort of ratio of 5 adults in each young person's lives that's really critical. And those adults obviously aren't always the parents. And it's always been really clear that young people need influential and positive adults, whether it's their coaches, teachers, parents of friends, looking at how are young people influenced by positive adults. So when it comes to accompaniment, we've got to look at how are we connecting young people and adults. And Pope Francis has spoken repeatedly over his time about inviting young people to meet with their grandparents, connect with them, learn with them, come and to learn to pray and pass on their faith and who they are as people, learn from their life experience. And we need to do that. So in this time of pandemic, as a father of 3 daughters and having to work at home for several months, I can tell you you can fall into that trap of you might be present, but you also might be absent at the same time, because you're still trying to juggle work, you're still trying to juggle everything in your life, even though you're locked up in this house together. So being purposeful and making connections during this time of pandemic is really important. And making time for videos and phone calls with grandparents, with aunties and uncles, with other people and friends, and allowing your children or the young people that you meet with as a community to have conversations with adults, not just with each other, to be purposeful and mindful of how we actually establish relationships and connections between adults and young people at this time.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about you, but when I hear about Pope Francis talking about grandparents, he must have had incredible grandparents, because that really is a part of his pastoral plan, is staying connected to the older generation, and particularly to grandparents. So, well, Malcolm Hart, I am so appreciative of all the work that you've done, appreciative of the time that we've had to interact at international gatherings, and it's been an honor to have you on the show.
Thank you very much. It's really appreciated, and what a great initiative to share at this time. So thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And Ashleigh, thank you. Your insights as a social worker were spot on, very needed, and it gives me some things to keep my eyes open for with the young people that I work with. So again, thank you so much.
Thanks, Rob. It's been great being here. Thank you so much.
Well, we do hear that this is the loneliest generation that there ever has been, and that is a worldwide dynamic. But there's also hope in the church. The church is rallying around her young people and providing guidance. Those new words that are everywhere right now, accompaniment, synodality, to join in with them, to walk with, and to mentor. I greatly appreciate both Ashleigh and Malcolm for sharing that with us. So again, if you are enjoying this content, please come to shalomworld.org. Also, be sure to download our app, where there is much more content, and we will be with you next time right here on HopeSpot at Shalom World.
To all of the viewers of Shalom TV throughout the world, I want to encourage you not only to support this amazing media apostolate, but to spread the word to others. We all know how the internet and mass media are polluting the world with the poison of pornography and so much other forms of materialism. This is the source of eternal life, the gospel, and Shalom TV is consecrated to spreading the word of Christ. Thank you.